Hello, friends. This is Dr. Lou. I am back for another series, an interesting series. We've been going through different topics in regard to religious studies or religion in general. Today, I want to explore the relationship between violence and religion, or or violence and religion. Okay, so the topic of violence and religion is one of the most debatable topics among scholars, not just scholars of religion, theologians, anthropologists, social scientists in general. It's a fascinating topic. Usually, scholars have taken have advanced different perspectives on this subject matter. Point A is that religion in itself is violent. Point B, um, the sacred text of many traditions promote violence. Uh, Say that the notion of the sacred itself, or God, is violent in nature. Okay, so there are different perspectives to try to navigate through this sensitive topic, just like the notion of God's goodness and the problem of evil in the world. That topic has been the occupation of scholars of religion, social scientists, theologian, humanities professors for hundreds, thousands of years. Still, we are not able to provide or to present uh, a plausible explanation to make sense of evil in the world. Now, in this conversation, I will not be discussing evil and religion. That's a different topic. That's a different category. Religion and violence and religion and evil. That's a different category, totally different category. Theological, theologically speaking, ethically speaking, and religiously speaking. So we're going to concentrate. We're going to focus on the relationship between violence and religion. I will be highlighting, briefly summarizing 10 to 12 major texts, classic texts on the subject matter. My cup says kindness counts. In fact, this is what all religious traditions or all religious people need. They need to show kindness to one another. The classic text, one of the classic texts, I would say, on the subject matter is the relationship. I'm sorry, was written by René Girard. René Girard, I believe, was a French scholar. In fact, he first published this book in French, bearing this title, La violence et le sacré. La violence et le sacré. It was published in 1972, and 5 years later, the book was translated in English as Violent and the Secret, right? So, let me say two or three things about this book. One of the major arguments Girard makes is that the notion of sacrifice itself, as we find in different traditions, whether we're talking about the Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and their rituals, for example, in the Old Testament, the Jewish scripture, the Hebrew scripture, you know, the killing of animals is a form of violence. The violence is done to the animal itself. So that should signal when that should signal the idea that religion in itself um, promotes violence. You see, violence against animal, the animal sacrifice. Again, this is a perspective held by many scholars. I do not hold that perspective. Anyway, my perspective does not really matter. I just want to highlight the major text to you. So um, so not only in this text he looks at the dynamics of culture and society in relation to religious rituals and how in the culture itself and in those societies violence become right violence becomes a norm. I was working on on an article several years ago, maybe I should say 7 or 8 years ago. I had the privilege to read this book and use this book as a theoretical framework for the article that I wrote. For example, Girard, there's a chapter where Girard talks about the function of sacrifice, right? The function of sacrifice in chapter 1. This is important. Why do you need to, why does God or the gods require, in some regard, animal sacrifices, right? The animal sacrifice or the sacrifice of animals. Um, yeah. Anyway, so this is a classic on the subject matter. That's all I have to say. Uh, Another important text. This book is not really a scholarly text, but it's a major text. Okay? It's called Holy War, the Crusades and their impact on today's world. This is a tour, some people call it a tour de force. Tour de force work. So we're talking about the Holy War. Now, in medieval time, 1095, you know, not only the Byzantine Empire was overthrown by Muslim Turks, and in fact, you see the emergence of Islam itself, for example, in many medieval societies in Africa carried violence. So Islam was imposed through violence. And I have nothing against Islam. I'm just telling you what happened historically. Okay? Was imposed to people by the sword. Okay? Just like in medieval time, the crusade, the Holy War of Crusade, where Christian warriors under the administration, the order of Pope Urban II, carried out a historical violence against the Turks when they were in the process to recover the holy city of Jerusalem from Islam. 1095. The crusade is a major event. It's a sad history. in the history of religion, more specifically in the history of Christianity, by Karen Armstrong. It was, I think, this book was a New York, it was probably a New York bestseller. Okay, Holy War: The Crusades and their impact on today's world. Talking about the Christian contribution to violence and evangelism. This is the book by Lewis and Rivera, A Violent Evangelism, the Political and Religious Conquest of the Americas. A Violent Evangelism, the Political and Religious Conquest of the Americas. Now, I'm not talking about Rivera is not talking about symbolic violence. He's talking about practical violence. Violence that affects people's lives. Violence that destroy human lives. Violence that brought about the end of an entire civilization. Okay, we're talking about still forced conversion of the natives, where Christian priests and theologians not only endorsed a violent evangelism, but they supported the Spanish Empire, the military conquest of the natives. Terrific work. In fact, the foreword of this book was written by Gonzalez, the great Christian Hispanic theologian historian, who wrote a 2-volume work on the history of Christianity. You know, 2-volume commonly used in and seminaries and divinity schools. I also want to point out the idea of global violence, of religious violence, the global rise of global violence, I should say, of religious violence, the global impact of religious violence. It's the book by Mark Juergensmeyer. I'm going to try to say his last name, but this is the book, Terror in the Mind of God. Terror in the Mind of God. This is a classic, The Global Rise of Religious Violence, Terror in the Mind of God. Here we're talking about chapter 1 discusses the notion of religious terrorism, right? You have people who are called themselves not only religious, whether they're Christian, they're Muslims, or they belong to other religious traditions. But you also have terrorism that is integral in some of the traditions, at least the way some people have interpreted certain religious texts to carry out their own um, agenda. So, what Mark is able to do here is to explore different traditions. For example, uh, remember the, the, abortion clinic bombings by Christians in the United States, and Timothy Mark McVeigh, and the violent encounter between Catholicism and Protestantism in Belfast. And you have the Zion group, radical Zion group, right? That's chapter 3 in the book. And the next one, Islam. Islam. And there's an interesting part in chapter 4 where Mark talks about modern Islamic justifications for violence. Sikhism, the sword of Sikhism. Then you have in Tokyo subway. So here we're talking about, this is not theoretical work. We're talking about examples of religious terrorism, examples, historical examples of religious violence in the world. Okay, and different traditions. Different traditions. Terror and the Might of God. The global rise of religious violence. I like this book because what Mark is trying to do here is to provide an inter-religious perspective on violence with some practical examples, like how religious fanatics have carried violence in the name of their religion. Violence unveiled humanity at the crossroad. By Gil Bailey, I think that's how you say his name. Some people call this book the most significant achievement and of great importance. I tell you what, it was René Girard who produced Violence and the Sacred, who said that about this book. This book was published in 1995. Another thinker calls this book the best explanation of violence I have ever read. Another book, commentator calls this book prophetic in its insight, breathtaking in scope. So, what the author is trying to do here is to establish the rise of violence and social disintegration in culture, in our culture, okay? And one of the elements that contributes to that violence is religion, okay? Yeah. This book is modeled after Girard's work, La violence et le sacré. Okay? Violence and the sacred. Okay. Now, let me pick up other books here. Charles Campbell wrote, When Religion Becomes Evil. Now, he highlights 5 major warnings or warning signs of corruption in religion that might contribute to violence. When religions make absolute claims, when religions promote blind obedience, almost all religion does that. When religion establish the ideal time, when the end justifies any means, when religions are involved in the so-called holy war. This is a terrific book on this subject matter. It was published in 2002. It's interesting. Charles Campbell begins the first chapter by asking the question: is religion the problem? Really? Some people have argued, in fact, religion is the problem. But you know what? The very first sentence in this chapter, Charles Campbell says, in fact, religion is a central feature of human life, a feature that brings meaning to life, but at the same time, it's complex, it's multi-dimensional. Okay? So, and of course, the 5 warning signs I mentioned, okay, are part of the book structure. When religion becomes evil, by Charles Campbell. Another text I want to bring your attention to. It's a book that makes a big argument for the roots of violence. The roots of violence which this author traced to Cain and Abel, the story of Cain and Abel, okay, where Cain kills, murders his brother Abel. Okay, so he's saying this is, if we want to explore, to understand the roots of the problem of violence in our world, we must begin with this account. Okay, this account. And of course, religion has a lot to do with this. Chris Hedges, we're going to talk about Chris Hedges, who wrote War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, right? Praises this book for its importance. Christopher Hitchens, which we're going to talk about Christopher Hitchens' work in a minute on the subject matter, also calls this book brilliant. Brilliant, brilliant. Now, I am going to turn to 3 major works on the subject matter. 3 major works by Sam Harris, The End of Faith, God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, God is Not Great. And these 3 major works give rise to what is now known as the New Atheism, right? New Atheism. Those gentlemen, thinkers, and of course, Richard Dawkins is a celebrated scientist, biologist, and he has made tremendous contribution, remarkable contributions, and in the field of biology. He's a prolific writer. Sam Harris is a philosopher. great thinker. And of course, Christopher Hitchens. Unfortunately, he passed several years ago. Was a great writer, a brilliant public intellectual. Brilliant and public intellectual. Okay. So let's look at this title. The End of Faith. Religion, terror, and the future of reason. The end of faith, religion, terror, and the future of reason. Now, you may not agree with Harris's thesis, central thesis. However, he makes good points. Some of his reasonings are remarkable. Some of the things that he says in this text, okay, did happen. For example, on page 126, we have many suicide bombing that were done in defense of Islam. Okay? There's actually a chart. Hope you can read this. Probably not. We have several